Professor Ganti Murthy is a professor in the discipline of bioscience and biomedical engineering. Before coming to IIT Indore, he was a tenured full professor at Biological and Ecological Engineering Department at Oregon State University, USA. He is a co-founder of GRW Engineering LLC, a resource recovery company focusing on recovering fertilizers, metals, and organics from landfill. Legit. Dr. Murthy's research is broadly focused on sustainable bioprocessing and systems analysis. Thank you, Professor Ganti Murthy ji. Over to you.
Hari Om, Matrubhyo Namaha, Pitrubhyo Namaha, Gurubhyo Namaha, Sabhai Namaha, Sabhapadibhyascha Namo Namaha. A very good morning to all of you, and it's my honor and pleasure to be back with you. I'm sorry that I'm not there physically. I really apologize for that. And but then we are joining online. At least that is something that gives me some solace. And today I will be talking about the Krishi Vijnana, agriculture, specifically focusing on the different sources, texts, schools, and thinkers that we have. And with that, let's get started. And if you look at really the prosperity of any society, you must have heard about the Angus Madison report, which talked about how India contributed about 25% of the world's GDP for about 2 millennia or so. And foundation for that prosperity were essentially two things: agriculture and trade. And therefore, these are essentially given highest importance in many thought processes, philosophical systems, and then they're the important foundations of our society. And that also led to a lot of developments associated with it, like, for example, the calendar systems to predict the weather, and then to know what is the direction of the monsoon wind so that you can actually travel in the open oceans. And then associated with that, the mathematics, development of mathematics, because if you want to go on an open ocean, you need high accuracy mathematics so that you can actually predict when the how the stars move, how the planets move, and how the earth is moving and all that, so that you can predict things. So then India, since our independence from Britishers, we have been very lucky in the sense that although we have fourfold increase in population since 1947, we have been self-sufficient in food production despite this fourfold increase. We were not really self-sufficient in food production until 1970s. That was only an element of last 200 years. Until that, we basically have been a food surplus nation. That is what helped us maintain that kind of world population, huge populations, and then drive the trade and become the Sone ki Chidiya that we talk about. And then we had, the thing that is necessary for the self-sufficiency in food production in the 70s is the Green Revolution. And but then, although we are now self-sufficient, there have been costs of that. For example, if you look at the soil organic carbon, there is a depletion of that throughout the country in the soils. So the organic matter in the soil has decreased. And this is a world over phenomena. Wherever we use fertilizers and high intensity agriculture, we see this kind of an issue. And then there is a depletion of groundwater, particularly in Punjab and Haryana. It is very pronounced. And there is water pollution because of basically the fertilizers running into groundwater. There is overuse of fertilizers, pesticides. You probably have heard of cancer train that runs from Punjab to Ahmedabad or Jaipur. And there has been a loss of biodiversity, lots of seed security because of some of the multinational companies that come and have a stranglehold on the seed varieties and things like that. But essentially, these are the costs that we have paid. And so, although we have been self-sufficient, there is something to look at. And this is where the agriculture that we practiced in India for several millennia can come and point a few things we can learn from that wisdom. Because that if you go back to look into what kind of agriculture did we have in India, there is confirmed archaeological evidence of agriculture in India about 10,000 years ago. So from the present, if you go back to 10,000 years, essentially that is about 8,000 BCE. We have archaeological evidence, especially in the Mehergarh and those sites in Balochistan. We have basically the excavations there. We found charred remains of barley. We eat some of the einkorn wheat, and these kind of grains were found. And the very first thing that, in fact, the Rig Veda Veda, one of the oldest Vedas, talks about a sukta, is dedicated a sukta called Kshetrapati Sukta. Where do we find the references of agriculture? It starts from the Vedas itself. The oldest Veda, Rig Veda, starts in the 4th mandala. The 57th sukta actually talks about it. It's called Kshetrapati Suktam. There it says Arvachi Subhage Bhava Site Vanda Mahetva. Basically, they are talking, and this is the first instance where the word Sita appears. Sita is essentially that pointed tip of the plowshare. And we also know Rama, Sita. That is where the first name of that Sita occurs in the Veda. It is in the Kshetrapati Sukta. Kshetrapati is essentially the lord of that land. Essentially, it's a farmer. And the Sukta dedicated to that. And also, coming later to Yajurveda, if you go to Taittiriya Upanishad, it also talks about food security in a big, big way. In fact, there is a something called Bhruguvalli, where it is told that Annam Brahmeti Vyajana. Know that the food is Parabrahma Swarupa. Annam na Nindyat. Do not disparage the food. Tad Vratam. Keep that as a Vrata. Keep that as your mission. Annam na Parichikshita Tad Vratam. Make sure that you don't waste food. Let that be your mission. So, and then Annam Bahukurvita Tad Vratam. Make sure that you produce a lot of food so that you can share it with others. Tasmad Daya Kaya Vidhaya Bhakvannam Prapniyat. Make sure that you obtain a lot of food so that you can actually give it and distribute it. So that kind of production of food and all that stuff was essentially very much well known even at that point of time. And then, also that how the plants come from inorganic matter was also explained in some of the this thing where we say Akashad Vayuhu Vayor Agni Agre Apaha Abhya Pruthivi Pruthivyam Oshadayaha. That means from the Akasha Tattva comes the Vayu Tattva. And from Vayu Tattva comes the Agni Tattva. And Agni Tattva comes the water, Vari or Apa Tattva. And then from that comes the Prithvi Tattva. And then from the Prithvi Tattva comes the Oshadaya. Oshadaya are the plants, essentially. And this was essentially, you see the growth of plants from all the inorganic matters from the soil and all. This was recognized much, much earlier. That is one of the suttas of the Vedas, one of the Vedas. And it talks about how everything rises from the Pancham. And it says from Oshadhaya we have Annat Purushaha. Ultimately, person is part of, basically this is used to prove how the Pancha Mahabhutas are part of any person. So it goes back to that, this thing there. So there is a lot of these kind of views in Vedas themselves. And then it's not just that kind of philosophical things, actually there are some practical things. In fact, in several verses in Krishna Yajurveda, they talk about agricultural operations. They talk about how you can do the land preparation, you can do basically the seed preparation, how do you need to basically water them, how do you need to take care of the pests, and how do you harvest it, what kind of tools do you use. All these things are talked about in the Yajurveda. There, when you look into these discussions of agriculture operations in Krishna Yajurveda, there is a very interesting distinction. In fact, one of the it talks about the wild and domesticated crops. For example, it talks about Nivaraha. Nivaraha is any wild, basically any variety of rice, but then there is something called Vrihaya. Vrihi is a wild type of rice, and Anavaha is rice. And Nivara is also type of many types of wild varieties of rice are also called Nivara. So there is a distinction made between the domesticated and the wild crops. And then if you look into the Indian subcontinent, different parts of our Indian subcontinent have been suitable for different types of the crops. In fact, you'll be very interested to know that in Rigveda, there is no talk of Vrihi or Nivara. There is no talk of rice. There is only talk of Yava and Godhuma. That is, Yava is barley and Godhuma is wheat. They only talk about wheat and barley. So that is one of the additional things to place the historicity of Rigveda to be much older, because around 10,000 years from the present was when 10,000 to 12,000 years from the present was when the wheat was domesticated. And that follows all the way from the Fertile Crescent to India and all these places. So essentially, there's a lot of evidence that still is coming out, and every archaeological discovery of these grains or some kind of evidence pushes back that history for some more years. But then There is only so much that you can go into the past, because when you look into the geological ages, the domestication of Pleistocene and Holocene, that basically that ice age, and then the Holocene is basically after that. That started around 14,000 years from the present. So before that, it is in the human history, we have only seen mostly the wild varieties that were harvested by people, but not really domesticated the crops. Domestication really picked up pace, although humans have been around for about 300,000 years or so, even more than that. But the domestication of crops picked up speed only after 14,000 years ago from present. So 12,000 years BCE. After that, it picked up pace, and then slowly things started. And there are multiple centers of domestication. For example, Indian subcontinent and China, they have been the places where the rice was domesticated. And then if you go to the Fertile Crescent and all the way up to the Punjab area, all that area, there the wheat was domesticated. Essentially, the point I'm trying to make here is that even in the Vedic times, there was distinction between the wild and domesticated crops. They also talk about pulses, all these things, but essentially there was that kind of a distinction. And there was also a knowledge of different crop development stages. For example, whenever the crop, there is something called a grain filling stage. Whenever a crop comes, you have a flower, and then you start seeing a small grain. And then that grain filling stage is the one where the starch starts accumulating in the grains. And that is a very, very important stage biologically for crops. If you have a problem during that stage, then the yield of the crop goes down really drastically. And what they used to do at that time was they really had identified that as a key stage, and they took extra care during those things. And then there are some verses which exhort farmers to consult wise men. For example, wherever you look into land preparation, plowing, farrowing, and maintenance of these furrows in the fields, the verses say, okay, you need to consult the Brahmanas and the wise men. And in fact, by the way, the farmer was called a Brahmana in Rig Veda and Yajurveda. So they said you need to consult the wise men who will actually help you in preparing to guide you in preparing the land, plowing and furrowing. And there were also some verses where they invoke divine blessings. So they don't talk about consulting wise men there. They say, okay, especially in the grain filling stage, they say, okay, invoke the blessings of the Surya, Marudganas, and Varuna. Surya, as you know, is essentially the god of sun god, Surya Deva, and essentially sunlight is essential for plants. And Marudganas are the gods of the winds. So you don't want high winds and you want pleasant winds and all that. And Varuna is the god of all the waters. So essentially they pray to these three things: sunlight, air and water. And you see, especially during the grain filling stage. And the difference between these two stages is, in the first one, where they exhort the farmers to consult wise men, these are things that a person can control. And whereas in the other ones, where the grain filling stage, you can't really control the environment, so they just say you pray for that. So even today we do that, right? Things that we can control, we put our efforts and then try to do a good job at it. And things that we cannot control, we just say, okay, we pray to the God. And that's essentially what these verses also ask. And this is in the Krishna Yajurveda. And then if you look at the crops, especially in the Saraswati Sindhu civilization, the tier 1 crops, which is probably the 80% of the grain that were found there, are wheat and barley. But in addition to that, there is this ragi, tuar dal, chana dal, moong dal, field peas, linseed, mustard, and also cotton. These are all found in the next abundant layer. The least abundant is actually rice in the Sindhu Saraswati civilization. And as the time goes on, and basically the more and more sites are found in the Ganga plains, Indo-Gangetic plains, then you find the rice being cultivated in a big way. And unfortunately, what we have done is, in India, we have not really spent a lot of time on archaeobotany. Until I think 30 years ago, we did not have a position for archaeobotanist in Archaeological Society of India. The point is, it is not that we don't have evidence. The point is, we did not have people to study. Americans started this in 50s. And because of that benefit, they went to Pakistan, all the Fertile Crescent area, and a lot of the North American sites and European sites. So there is a lot of evidence that was collected over the last 70, 80 years. But in India, we only started it in the last 30, 40 years. So only few sites, and it's picking up. There is a need to study these things even more, because there are almost a competing thesis that many crops were domesticated even in the Indian subcontinent as well, because that change from the Pleistocene age to Holocene is what is looked at as a big crux of essentially when the human civilization became more sedentary, found basically agriculture and then settled down. But there is also, if you look into the Pleistocene ages, then Indian subcontinents, parts of the Indian subcontinents were the only one which were really habitable for a lot of for humans. The rest of the northern Europe, and all that were covered in huge glacial ice sheets. So, if you want to really look into that, we need to look into especially the southern part of India, where there could be a lot of evidence, archaeological evidence, waiting to be discovered. And there was a accelerated phase of agriculture in India from about 800 BC, and this was something that was seen everywhere. And there was some kind of a hiatus between late phases of Indus Valley civilization, and we talk about when Saraswati River was flowing to the Gulf of Cambay. Then there was a lot of agriculture there, but then human populations were very less. After that, slowly, once they moved to the Ganga plains, then the acceleration happened, and especially in the 800 BCE to 0 CE, last 2,800 years ago, there was a burst in agriculture, and this was seen throughout the world, and because of the climatic factors and all that, and all the many of the Vedas and all, they discuss these different plowing, furrowing, seeding, cultivation, irrigation, weeding, harvesting, classification of crops. All of these point to very advanced agriculture in the society with very high level of expertise. And this was something that you can look into even in the Vedic ages. And Vedic ages, I mean 8000 BCE to about 1000 BCE or 800 BCE. After that, you have the classical period kind of starting essentially in India. So these were by that time, most of the crops were domesticated, nothing was really left. And in fact, you might be surprised to know, normally maize, the corn, is thought to be a crop from the South America or Mexico, in that area. So recently, I think last 10 or 15 years ago, in one of the valleys of Sikkim, they found a wild variety of maize, which is not found anywhere else. And so there are some, and then if you look at the cultural aspects of Sikkim, Sikkimese people, there they place a higher importance in the rituals onto the corn cobs, the maize cobs, than the rice. So it is thought that that could be another independent center of maize, basically domestication in the world, apart from the Mexico. So there is so much to be studied when you look into these things. You may say, why is this important? Why is this important that I study where the crops have come from? Or why is it really necessary to look into the wild strains of the crops? It is important because whenever you want to look into the crop diversity, so that you can actually develop varieties that will withstand some of the climate change crises that we are facing. So let's say you want to develop a salt tolerant hybrid, or you want to develop a dwarf variety, or you want to develop a new colored variety, or you want to develop a early maturing variety of any crop. You actually can go into the wild varieties, and then that is a much wider genetic pool, and you can do that in a much faster way. So there is a lot of scope for crop development. Therefore, it is important for us to know where these crops have come from and use that. So it is not a ideal theoretical discussion about where did we find it and all that. So there is some practical uses as we go forward, even in that case. Again, talking about different types of crops in the Vedic age, it talks about basically requests. The Chamaka Prashna, which is a very famous one in Krishna Yajurveda, talks about Puyavaha, which are all the small grains, Annam, Akshu. Akshu means essentially being free from hunger. And Vrihayaha, Yavaha, Mashaha, Tilaha, Mudgaha, Khalvaha, Godumaha, Masuraha, Priyangavaha, Anavaha, Shamakaha, Nivaraha. All of these things are basically asked for. And if you can think about it, Krishna Yajurveda goes back many thousands of years ago. So essentially, even if you just look at it from this point of view, some of the Aryan invasion myths and all that, you can just straight away dismissed straight away, because these could not have been domesticated in 1600 or so. I mean, that actually indicates a much, much older civilization, even just looking at the crop varieties that we're talking about. Okay. And then coming to the classical age, talking about Chanakya and Arthashastra, basically looking at Chanakya's Arthashastra, he devotes several chapters to agriculture and its proper management, because he realizes that agriculture is foundation of the prosperity and trade and the prosperity for the king and the kingdom. Therefore, it is important that the agriculture be managed properly. So there is a separate agriculture department, and there is a designated head to that called Sitadhyaksha. And then he talks about different cropping patterns. He talks about Kedara, which are essentially the wet crops. He talks about Haimana, which are the winter crops. Graishmika, which are summer crops. These correspond to what we use these days. The terms that we use are Kharif, Rabi, and Zaid. These are kind of Persian words, but essentially this is the same classification that Chanakya used. Kedara, Haimana, and Graishmika. And then he also talks about, for example, not just the cropping patterns and all that, but different taxes. The taxes at that time was 1/6 of the produce would go to the king. So about 16% taxes, lower than what we pay today. And farmers, there were also incentives. For example, farmers who dug a pond to harvest the rain water in their farm, they were exempted from taxes for 5 years. Why? Basically because they knew that this would help not only that farmer but also the neighboring farmers, because of the groundwater percolation. All the others would also benefit, and increased production would actually contribute to the society, societal prosperity. So that is perhaps one of the first recorded subsidy to farmers in any recorded history. Just that note. Then if you look into so that was essentially about agriculture. Associated very closely with agriculture are weather and water. So water cycle, the hydrologic cycle was described even Yajurveda time, Shukla Yajurveda time. In Shatapada Brahmana, it talks about Agnirve Dhumo Jayate Dhuma Abhramaha Abhrat Vrishti. So essentially that is the basics of the this thing, hydrologic cycle. Fire creates vapors. Fire here also means heat, essentially. And then the vapor creates clouds, and clouds give the rain. And basically, Surya, one of the names of Surya is Apam Mitra, one who is a friend of water. And I mean, there are a lot of things where you see names described as one who creates the clouds and one who distributes water and all that stuff. I mean, you'll see that this was recognized much, much earlier. And the famous shloka that we say, right? Akashat patitam toyam yatha gacchati sagaram sarvadeva namaskaram keshavam pratigacchati. That actually talks about how water falling from the sky, akashat patitam toyam, water falling from the sky, yatha gacchati sagaram, as it goes towards the sea. So essentially all the water falling in goes to the sea. That essentially is concept of surface and the groundwater essentially flowing there. Similarly, Sarvadeva Namaskaram, Keshavam Pratigacchati. All the Namaskaras for all the Devas go to Keshava. So this is just a shloka which we recite even in pujas, even today. And then, very importantly, rainfall was considered as Purva Chitti. Purva Chitti means prior wisdom. So this was essentially considered something that could be predicted. That was the important thing. And even if you look at the Panchanga today, they predict the rainfall 6 months later. And Varahamihira discusses this. One of the earliest agriculture texts talk about this also. And the rainfall prediction methods are pretty common in all of the books, actually. In fact, they talked about 3 components that will influence the weather and the rains. And they talk about the space, essentially your atmosphere. They talk about the environment, Bhuvaha, Swaha, Suvaha, and then Bhu, the agriculture, the Bhumi. So all 3 were considered to be something that would influence Surya, Chandra, Graha, the planetary motions, and then the atmosphere, and then the land itself. All of these 3 were something that was said to influence the weather. Even today we have the same kind of concept. In fact, there is a paper by Professor Kale et al. And they really look to the concept of the rain delivery theory of Varahamihira, because Varahamihira talks about something called a Garbhottama. Garbhottama is putting the seed in the Garbha. And then he says, just like a Garbha takes 9 months, seeds of this also take about 180 days. So he talks about that this rain falling here is influenced by what happens 195 days earlier or 180 days earlier around that time. So that essentially is called a Garbhodakata. And there is some evidence when you look at even from the modern perspective that the flow of the jet streams that come from the Himalayas down the Indian subcontinent, you actually can, by their movement, you can predict what the rainfall is going to be in June, July, when the monsoon time, by looking at them 6 months to 8 months before the actual event. So by November or December, you should be able to look at the location of this jet stream and predict with a reasonable accuracy whether we are going to have a lot of rains or less rains, kind of. I mean, it's not going to be accurate up to the days. It will give you that whether we'll have lot of rain or less rain. That's it. There are different levels of this weather rainfall prediction. So this is one of them. And there is actually a ritual in Atharvana Veda where the practitioner is asked to do a homam and then climb a hill and then look at the Kritika Nakshatra. And Kritika Nakshatra is a Pleiades constellation. When you look at it, it says that if it is clear, you are going to get less rain, and if it is hazy, you are going to get more rain in the monsoon, coming monsoon, Varsha Ritu. And that has thing because it becomes hazy if you have that jet stream come in and clear when the jet stream is moved away. And that has got something to do with how the monsoon pattern, monsoon winds move 6 months later, 6 to 8 months later. And that's how they predict it. And this was the kind of the model that they had in mind. And there is some kind of that validation that Professor Kale et al. Did it. But again, still more needs to be done. And many rishis have described, whoever has been connected with agriculture have discussed this rainfall prediction. For example, rishis like Kashyapa, Parashara, Gautama, Vatsa, they all talk about rainfall prediction. They talk about short-term and long-term weather forecasts. And for example, there is a book on agriculture. We'll talk about it a little later. It's called Krishi Parashara. It talks about long-term prediction, 6 to 7 months, short-term prediction, less than 1 week, and also talks about something immediate predictions, just like nowcasting in a few hours or so. So that you do by observing plants, you observe ants, you observe the behavior of the birds, and then you can predict what happens in next few hours or 1 or 2 days. And then if it is less than 1 week, there is a different method to predict it. And 6 to 7 months is kind of that Garbhottama theory that Varahamihira has described in Brihat Samhita. And Parashara very interestingly talks about 4 different types of basically clouds as well. It's not just one type of cloud they talk about. They say clouds are of different types: Avarta, Samavarta, Pushkara, Drona. Very similar to the kind of classification that we have even today. Of course, they're all based on observations and kind of thing. So you can say that essentially they were very scientific in their approach by that. And then when you look at the modern weather forecasting, there is something called nowcasting, which you do for a few hours: short range, medium range, and long range forecast, which are more than 10 days. If you look at it, I mean, there is nothing long range, really long range that Krishi Parashara talks about, which is 6 to 7 months in advance. It's very difficult to do that, even today. And I think today we use 32 model rainfall prediction method. Earlier we used to use a 16 model parameter rainfall model, Indian Meteorological Department. And basically now it has to be updated. Things have to be updated. Even these things have to be updated based on different parameters and things like that. So this was about the weathers, rains, and forecasting. So now the other important thing when we talk about agriculture is the soils. So our texts, the agriculture texts, have classified it on based on various different things. The first thing that they have classified it is on based on the ability to produce crops. So they call something as a urvara soil if it is very fertile and produces a lot of good amount of crops. And usara is something that is non-fertile. And but some things, shrubs and things will grow, so it is good for a pasture land or something like that. And Maru is essentially the desert land. There's also another classification based on the color of the soil. Bhabru is essentially the brownish in color soils, which are okay, and Krishna are the black color, which are plowable. You can easily plow them. And Rohini is a reddish color soil, which is capable of growing any vegetation. So you can see they're talking about fertility, they're talking about color. They also talk about the agroclimatic. That is also very interesting to see. They talk about the climate-based classification. They say there is Jangala, which is essentially the barren or soils in the dry region. And Arupa, are soils that are moist, essentially the marshy and swampy soils. And then Sadharana is essentially the ordinary soils found everywhere. And so you can see the richness of the classification that they have done. And they have also done it based on the topography. Whether you have basically a flat topography on the yellow soils that is called Matasi, and Dorsa, which are like dark soils, especially on the hill slopes, and Kanhar, dark and heavier than Matasi or Dorsi. Essentially, this is in the lowlands where they used to grow the rice and wheat cultivation. And Bhata are essentially the barren lands, in the uplands especially, and gravelly, yellowish in color, sandy and all that. Also, Arthashastra and the Mughal period, they all classify the soils based on the revenue, because especially by the time it came to the Mughals, there was no distinction maintained between the type of the land and the soil. They said if the soil, the land produces revenue, that is what I'm going to look at, the profitability, economic part. And so they talked about Khalsa, which is essentially the primary revenue yielding land, and then the Jagir, which is essentially something that a king gives to the noble people or some of his ministers and all those followers. They will take the taxes, collect the taxes from that, and then keep a part of it and then give a part of it to the king. That essentially is the Jagir. And Sayur Ghal is essentially land that is granted for cultivation without any tenure. That's so essentially you see that three different types of gradations. Khalsa is where the king directly collects the revenue. Jagir is one they indirectly collect it, and Sayur Ghal is something that is not really you don't get revenue on that. In the 20th century, now we classify. I mean, this is one of the older classifications, but still a good one. So these are like we classified based on different types of soil properties to about classifications. So alluvial soils, black soils, red soils, which by the way meet what we are talking about here. The red soils are your Rohini and black soils are your Krishna, if you see that. And that's the kind of alluvial soils are pretty much similar to this Kanhar in the lowlands. And the laterite and lateritic soils are some of the red ones, but barren, more rocky. Forest soils, desert soils, saline or alkaline soils, peaty soils. These are essentially the different classifications of soils in 20th century. But you can see there was a rich type of classification that was done from multiple perspectives on soils. And now comes to the, let us talk about, we have talked about the water, weather, we have talked about soil, let's talk about the land preparation. So in the land preparation, when you look at that, plowing the land or tilling the land is probably the most energy intensive operation in agriculture. And this requires a lot of input. And in India, different types of plows were used. And based on different geographical locations, whether you're talking about Punjab, whether you're talking about Ganga Plain, or you're talking about Kaveri Delta, or you're talking about Gujarat or Madhya Pradesh, there were different types of plows that were used. And they were optimized for different soils, climate, and seeds, and the needs for the Indian subcontinent. Then, one of the things that this was mentioned in Dharampal's collected writings of Dharampal. What these were basically the kind of reports that the Britishers sent to London, back to London, when they were coming to India for the first time, and then they were learning about India. They studied India in quite a lot of detail. And during that time, they looked at all the technology and the science and all of those aspects that we had in India. And then they used to write them back to London and send reports on it. So that Indian Science and Technology in 18th century is a book of such collected writings of people, which Dharampalji went and collected and then published it as many volumes. This is the first volume. And in that, there is a chapter on agriculture. So these are the observations made by Britishers. The Indian plows were light and were optimized to reduce the drudgery to animals. And they were very different from the heavy plows used in Europe. And then in India, the farmers used what is called as a drill plow. Essentially, the drill plow means you are plowing and then seeding at the same time. And at least for a millennia, they had used. And drill plow was something of innovation there in basically in Europe at that time. And some of these things that they describe in this 18th century were basically described in exact language in Krishi Parashara and Vrikshayurveda of Surapala. Krishi Parashara is a very, very ancient text. Vrikshayurveda is about 1000 years old text. So they were all described in the same way. So essentially what that points to is that we had a continuous tradition of optimized farm equipment. And then you may say, why is it that very heavy plow that is used in Europe, why is that a problem? It is a problem because if you use a heavy plow, you need an animal that will pull it. That also has to be very heavy and very strong to pull a very heavy plow. And that means you have to start seeing those Belgian horses, which are very, very muscular and all that. They're like almost like bulls. They pull the horse, pull the plows, and then they don't eat grass. They need a lot of grain to be. They need to be fed with grains. And then Vaclav Smil, in his one of the he's a Canadian author, a professor there in I think of Ontario or Manitoba. So he has written a book called Energy and Civilization. There he has done energy analysis of different animals and what kind of inputs do they need and what kind of grains and all those things need to be fed. So when you use a heavy horse, draught horse, it requires to be fed with about 1/3 the produce of the land. So essentially imagine that if you are producing 100 kilograms of grain, because these horses are heavy, they can't survive on grass, you need to feed them 33 kilograms of the grains that you have produced so that they actually can pull the heavy plow. But on the other hand, in India, the bulls that we used actually subsisted on the grass, which was essentially harvested after the straw and all those things that were harvested, the leftovers, which were not really useful for human consumption. So the bulls would basically not require any amount of this grain that was produced. But then the thing is, they were not as strong as the horses. But then it didn't matter because our plows in India did not require that kind of a heavy plow. They were light and optimized for the Indian conditions. So they would only plow to 5 to 10 centimeters. But then there is a talk, there is actually references in the basically many books like Vedas and also some of the textbooks that we talk about in agriculture, where there were 2 bulls, 4 oxes, there were 6, 8, 10, 12, even up to 24. So it was not that we did not use heavy plows. They were also used sometimes. But most of the time, we use these light plows, which just require 2 bullocks, which could be fed with the grain, not the grain, but the straw that was left over and some green grasses, that fodder that were there. What this did to India's agriculture was that India's agriculture became very, very efficient. And what that did was we were able to support huge populations. And you see why in Bharatiya culture we place such a premium to the cow, bulls and all those things. It is also because they use some of these grains, not the grains but the straw, and then actually they give something. They really are really responsible for a lot of the upliftment that we have seen in human society, at least in India. The same argument is made by Vaclav Smil as well. And so just I wanted to show you some of the implements that were described. For example, the Parashara Maharshi, he talks about this kind of a plow. You see, this is where the yoke is. So this is where the bulls are going to be harnessed. This is the plow. And you see this part is made of iron. This part is made of iron. Rest of it is wood. And this is Hastagrahi. That is where they hold it. And then basically you can see the dimensions of these and what it should be. This is one of the types of the plows that is talked about by Parashara Maharshi. Then this is another one, which plow integrated with the seed drill. So you can see this is where we put the bulls. These are the seed drills. So you put grains here, somebody stands here, then they put the grains. And then as this goes, the grains are dropped here, and then this part covers the soil. So this part makes a hole like this. The seed falls, and then this is covered by this part. Seed is covered. So essentially you have 3 rows of seeds that are planted. And this is a very, very useful implement that reduces the drudgery also. And this was something that was discovered in the last 200-300 years elsewhere, but we knew about this long, long time ago. And then this is another one, which one also was a different type of seed drill. You can see instead of three different receptacles, three different things for putting seeds, you just have one, and that divides it to different places. You can see that, and that's how this works. And then this is another one, which is a plow, deep plow. So because different seeds need to be plowed at different depths, so this is a deep plow with one this thing, and so you see different types of a harness here. And then this is another type of basically plow. Why I'm talking about plows is you can see the different varieties of these plows, and all of them were made with local materials. They were made locally by the farmers in the village, and they were suited for that particular region. So this is another one. This is the top one that you see there is supposed to be used by Maharaja Prithu. So you can see how it's a little different. And this one is Parashar Maharshi's plow, which has arrow pointed kind of an arrow kind of a thing, very sharp. So it cuts the soil, then takes it. And these are the other implements that were used. So you can see different types of things that were there. All these are all different implements for seeding operations and things like that. So again, let's talk about one other aspect, which is, so we have talked about seeds, and let's talk about animal husbandry, because animals are really important for basically doing all these seeding operations, any of the basically operations that are there in the farm. So agriculture and animal husbandry, they really went together. They were not separated in India. They were all going together. And as I was mentioning earlier, using bullocks which consume grasses, it is more efficient than using powerful horses which require grain to be fed. And the kind of designs that were made were not only ergonomically efficient, but also designed to reduce the drudgery of the farm animals. That's how these implements were designed. So it's a very sensitive culture that not just thought about itself, but also the animals and all that. In fact, one of the Vaidika Sukta says, may we cut the soil happily, may the farmer plow the field happily, may the bullocks pull the plow happily, may the Kshetrapati bless us all with seeds grow happily, and then bless us all with abundant crop and all those things. So I mean, it's a very, so they were all looking for not just, it was not a very anthropocentric kind of operation when they thought about agriculture and animal husbandry. And then it's also that the ethical treatment of animals was placed at a very high premium. In fact, Krishi Parashara warns that Vahapidar Jitam Sasyam Phalitam Cha Chaturganam Vahanihi Shwasavatena Tad Drutam Cha Vinashyati. What does that means is Vahapidar Jitam Sasyam. The sasyam, the crop that is obtained by doing the pida, torturing the animals that are basically pulling the plows and all those operations, helping in the operations, even if that is 4 times, Phalitam Cha Chaturganam, even if it is 4 times, you can obtain more yields, 4 times yields by torturing the animals, all of that will go by the Shwasavatena Tad Drutam Cha Vinashyati. It will all be destroyed by the tears and then the angry things that these animals breathe out, and it will all be lost by the sins caused by their exhaustion. That is what Krishi Parashara wants. In fact, another thing, we are all familiar with that this thing, right? Ahimsa Paramo Dharma. Where it occurs is in Anusharasana Parva, chapter 11, 117, 37th shloka in Mahabharata, where it talks about that Ahimsa Paramo Dharma was a statement made in the context of protecting animals. So it is talked about in terms of not causing any harm to animals, and where it says Ahimsa Paramo Dharma Tatha Ahimso Amo Dhamma Ahimsa Paramam Dhanam Ahimsa Paramam Tapah. That means Ahimsa is the Paramo Dharma, highest of all dharmas. Paro Dhamma, it is the highest of all Dhamma, Dhanam and Tapa. All of these are highest when you practice ahimsa towards animals. So it is talked about in that context. And then Kautilya also talks about it in Arthashastra. He talks about how it is, to protect not just the domesticated animals but also the wild animals. So there was a strict prohibition on hunting indiscriminately. Even the king was not supposed to hunt just for pleasure. That concept of pleasure hunting only came with Mughals and Britishers. Before that, the king was supposed to go on a hunt only if the farmers and the villagers complained about the attacks of the animals, cruel animals on their farms and fields. That was only when the king went and tried to kill some of these animals. It was otherwise it was not prohibited. It was not allowed for the king to go out. And then there were seasons when he could go and hunt. It was not that they could go and hunt any time of the year. Whenever there was this mating period of the animals, it was strictly forbidden to go and hunt during that time. And whenever it was strictly forbidden to hunt the smaller animals. There were all kinds of rules, even to hunt cruel animals. And for the domesticated animals also there were many rules. And strict punishment were given to people who actually cause intentional harm. And the same thing also occurs not just in Arthashastra but also in Manu's Dharma Sutra. Now that was kind of the background of what kind of agriculture we practiced. So I hope I have tried to give you some kind of a background about all the agriculture operations. Now I'll be more specific. I'll talk about the texts related to agriculture in India. So when you look at texts, there can be many types of sources. So you can distinguish between the primary sources, for example, the translated primary sources, the secondary sources. That essentially is based on the source. And then the type of resources, whether it is a manuscript, book, research paper, or monograph, that essentially is another way you can classify. Location, where is it available, is another way to classify. I'll primarily focus on the type of sources right now. And if you look at it, these are, I had talked about Rig Veda, Yajurveda, basically your Atharvana Veda, Arthashastra, all those things. But then there are some dedicated agricultural textbooks in India. In fact, the first one that you see in the list, Krishi Parashara, was about agriculture. A textbook wholly dedicated only to agriculture. Nothing else. No philosophy, no Sahitya, no Natya Shastra, nothing. It is basically an agriculture textbook. This is perhaps the world's first agricultural textbook. It was written in 4th century BCE. So 2600 years from the present. And based on the way that it describes some of the weather prediction, rain prediction models, and the type of crops, type of soils, and all those things, we can estimate that region to be around Sialkot right now, which is in Pakistan. Yes, essentially, that was all India at that time. Author was Parashara. And now, then comes another book. Basically, another book I have not listed here. It is because it is not completely dedicated to agriculture. Another one is Brihat Samhita. That also has a big chapter on agriculture, chapter on classification of plants, all those things are there. But then later, in around 800 CE, so about 1200 years ago, there is something called Kashyapiya Krishi Sukti. This is essentially a treatise on agriculture. The author was supposed to be Kashyapa, and the region based on the description of the book is essentially the Krishna Godavari Delta of Andhra Pradesh. And then very famous book, third one, is the Vriksha Ayurveda, which is written by Acharya Sunapala 1000 years ago. And he was basically in the central and east India. That essentially is what the region that we can guess based on the kind of prescriptions that he makes. Then there was also something called Lokopakara in 1025 CE. So about around similar time. This was Chaudanarya. He basically was from Karnataka, and basically that was again a textbook. Another one was by Vishwavallabha, who wrote this book on the inspiration of one of the Maharana Pratap. This was Chakrapani Mishra who wrote this book, and in fact he says that. And then the region that he talks about is Mewar and Udaipur. And we can just put the period very, very closely to 1540 to 1597 CE. And he talks about straight away, for example, how do we know these books, I mean, if you read the Vishwavallabha, he doesn't talk about rivers or any of that stuff. He directly goes into groundwater. He talks about how do I make a small dam, how do I do rainwater harvesting. And if you go to basically Kashyapiya Krishi Shukti, there is no discussion of that. It's much more about how do I irrigate, how do I make a canal, those kind of things. So you can actually look at that. And then there is another one that Dara Sikho wrote in, basically edited it in 17th century, which was essentially for integrating the knowledge from the Central Asia and the Mughal kingdom at that time. It's called Nuskadar Fannat Falahat and Art of Agriculture, 17th century book. Then in this one, Dara Sikho, being the very broad-minded person he was, he tries to look into all of these practices, and it is a book written in Persian. And they talk about all the practices of India and also Persian practices, how they were all there. And by the way, Jahangir, as cruel a king as he was also somebody who was very investigative and very keen eye. Would almost be called like a scientist when it came to botany and some of the practices of agriculture. He was a big lover of gardens and all that, flowers and flower gardens. So Jahangir, in his own memoirs, writes a lot about these kind of things as well. But then this Nuskadar Fanni Falahat is a book dedicated to agriculture. So these are all books that do not talk about anything else but agriculture. There is Krishi Gita, which is a book from Kerala, written by Parashurama. Remember that we have a tradition in India where we use a lot of the names of the rishis from the Gotra of the person who is writing it. So perhaps that is one kind of a example of that, Parashurama here. This is not the same Parashurama that we see in the Ramayana. This is written in 17th century for Kerala Konkan region. So it will have a very different way of managing water resources compared to Vishwavallabha, for example. And there is something called Upavana Vinoda in the Bundelkhand region around the 13th century, written by Sarangadhara. Again, this doesn't talk about anything else but talks about the gardens and how do you have different types of gardens for pleasure, essentially, for enjoyment. And then there is another book called Manasollasa, Someshwara Deva, again in Karnataka region, 12th century CE. So you see, what you see from all of these are all primary texts. These are all written in Sanskrit or Malayalam. For example, the Krishi Gita is written in Malayalam. Nuskadar Fanni Falahat is written in Persian. So you'll see all kinds of things. So, they were all dedicated only to agriculture. All the way going from the very first textbook in the world, the Krishi Parashara, you see a continuous basically progression of different types of textbooks for different regions and things like that. Now comes the secondary text. So these are all the primary texts, especially if you look into the publications of Asian Agricultural History Foundation, which has done some yeoman service in this area. They have wonderful publications that I would recommend all of you to take a look at it, please. I have only talked about the agriculture part, but there is also a equally very good classification of Mrigapakshi Shastra. That is the third book that you see here in this in that list. Mrigapakshi Shastra talks about different types of animals, both domesticated and wild animals, talks about different plants and pakshis, the birds, and describes their characteristics and all. It's a fantastic zoology textbook, essentially, if you look at it. It talks about different types of lands. It talks about cheetahs, because cheetahs were extinct only in 1940s. So at that time, there was cheetahs. It talks about how you can look into all that. And of course, in the secondary agricultural text, you can look into Dharmapalji's writings. And then there is another book called A Concise History of Science in India, which is edited by Professor Bose, Sen, and Professor Subbarayappa. And please look into the second edition. It is, again, a very good book. It has a lot of these kind of things catalogued in a very good way, but very concise way. And these are some of the secondary agricultural texts. And then, in addition to these were all about the foundational knowledge, which are essentially transmitted in a parampara way, systematized knowledge base. Like Ayurveda has a lot of texts, we have a lot of texts like here. But then, we also know agriculture is something that is practiced universally. And therefore, a lot of knowledge is embedded in the oral traditions and practices of people. So, what ICAR has done is starting in around 2000 or so, because this was fresh from that basically battle where neem was haldi and neem were being patented and all that nonsense that was taking place in US, where they were taking some of our traditional knowledge and doing that. So they created a inventory of India's indigenous technical knowledge in agriculture, and there are 2 volumes which basically collected various information practices. For example, I'm just giving you 3 examples just to see. So, for example, look at the second one here. The storage of pulses with neem leaves. Neem leaves are put in pulse bags for storage because neem leaf affect the hatching of storage pest eggs. This was a practice that they found in Karnataka. And then there was something called nut grass management with goat manure. So, if you want basically the nut grass to be growth to be controlled, they apply goat manure because that nut grass is a weed. Because when goat manure actually acts as a retardant, growth retardant for the nut grass, which is a weed. So you see how they are managing the weed management. This is another weed management technology. This is harvest, post-harvest management. And then this one is for harrowing and moisture conservation. So basically, how they do it is they do the harrowing for done in a plowed field, and then 8 to 10 centimeters, and then they do it so that you conserve the moisture. 8 to 10 centimeters, not very deep. And then this is done to remove weeds, first of all, prepare the soil bed, and then conserve the rainwater in the soil. This is a practice in Solapur, which is a kind of a dry region. So you can see they collected 1998, about 2000 practices throughout the country. That is what they documented in these document 1 and document 2. And then they didn't stop it. They went and validated it. So let's say this practice in Karnataka talks about neem leaves, right? What they did was they actually conducted a scientific study, and then they saw whether this thing actually matches or not with what this observation, this practice is saying. And they did that, and that is documented in a book, in the document 3. Then they also did a cross-sectional validation. So what this means is they took the practices of Karnataka, and then they saw that whether that makes sense in Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Jammu Kashmir, or Assam, whether that really is something that is universally valid. So they did that cross-sectional validation as well. That is documented in document 4. Then they also went, as they were doing this, they also made sure that there is geographical indication of different plant species. So these are essentially 5 documents that the ICAR, Indian Council of Agricultural Research, has published starting in 2002 to 2007. So it's a wonderful source of information, scientific validation of evaluation of different indigenous technical knowledge, and about 2000 practices that we actually can use even today. And I will also talk about, now I had said that these books that I had discussed were all primarily agricultural. Let's take a look at one of these textbooks, and then I will show you what does it contain. And I will basically focus on Vriksha Ayurveda because it is a very, very famous book in agriculture. So what does that contain? Essentially, these are the sections that this Vriksha Ayurveda contains. The first one, it starts off with the salutation to Ganesha, starts off with Ganeshaya Namaha, and then says what this book is, because every book, every Shastra in Bharatiya Jnana Parampara will start with a Prayojana, describing who is the Adhikari, what is the Prayojana, what is the Sambandha, and what is the Vichya. It starts with that. Then it talks about the importance of trees, and then talks about merits and demerits of trees planted near the residence. So it talks about which tree species should be planted, which should not be planted, what distance should be planted. There is propagation, method of planting. These are all chapters in that book. Nourishment of plants, elements of plants, how do we treat it, horticulture, pleasure gardens, natural indications of groundwater, the plant indicators for crop and animal production. So, for example, in the, I'm not going to go into these early 4, but when we talk about nourishment, for example, there's a very famous thing that called Kunapa Jala. Essentially, how is it made? It is made by the excreta, marrow of bones, flesh, brain, and blood of boar mixed with water and stored underground is called Kunapa. This is essentially consists of high protein substances. Sometimes we use oil cake also. Any raw and flesh meat that is wasted, They put it all together with cow dung, with some milk, some ghee, and mix it with water, sugar, jaggery, mix it with water, ferment it for 15 days with occasional stirring, and then they filter it out. And that water is called Kunupa Jala. That is essentially applied foliarly. So you apply it in the leaves of the plants, and that actually acts like nano fertilizer that actually can be absorbed by the leaves directly in the plant. And this is something that is a wonderful fertilizer, liquid fertilizer, that has been described by Surapala. And he says, he doesn't say that he invented it. He says, this recipe has been given to me by my elders who have been practicing it. I also took it, I practiced it, then only I'm writing this book. He says that in the Vriksha Ayurveda, that I'm not writing anything here that I don't know. And then when we talk of elements, very interestingly, they talk about all the disease types can be divided into two things, internal and external. And Ayurveda, is based on Vata, Pitta and Kapha. And that is what they also base the plant health also, and also the animal health also. So Ayurveda, you talk about Ayurveda for humans, Vriksha Ayurveda for plants, or Pashu Ayurveda for animals, all of them, the health perspective, from the health perspective, they are looked at as a balance of Vata, Pitta and Kapha. That model coming, the Vata, Pitta, Kapha arising from the Pancha Mahabhutas, and then their balance is essentially what is health, is essentially something that is maintained throughout, whether we talk about humans, animals or plants. And internal basically elements are caused by imbalance of Vata, Pitta, Kapha, and there are ways to treat it. And then the external ones can be caused by insects, cold weather, all those other elements that are not basically internal. Just to give you an example of what kind of treatment they talk about, for example, they talk about, let's say there are worms accumulated on the trees. Then you can treat it very quickly by smoking the trees with a mixture of white mustard, ramatha, vidanga, vacha, ushana, and the water mixed with beef, horn of buffalo, flesh of pigeon, and the powder of bhallataka, which is again powder. So you can see all of these things must be mixed, and then it must be used as to generate that smoke. And what this will do is it creates a fumigation. This is a classic fumigation method that they are describing. And the key ingredients there are the mustard, ramatha, vidanga, vacha, and ushana. These are the key ingredients. White mustard, when you smoke it, it gives off toxic fumes which will kill the worms immediately, worms or any of the insects that are there outside. So the idea was you have to go in the field with carrying the smoke. Others are to create the smoke, other elements are to create that smoke, and essentially that will very clearly clear off the worms that are infested. And this is a fumigation method that they are talking about. And the cost of actually using these is not also very high. There is a Center for Indian Knowledge Systems in Chennai, where Sri A.V. Balasubramaniam ji and his team have done a lot of studies on the economics of these things. Because whenever we hear the words like it requires some milk, ghee and curd, we think that it may be costing a lot. But actually, when you look at it, it doesn't cost a lot. In fact, it costs much less than any of the pesticides. Then, this other one about natural indications of groundwater. So look at the first statement that they make. Currents of water rise upwards and spread in all directions beneath the ground. And it says that essentially is what we are talking about, groundwater aquifers. It says that investigating these, one should plan where to dig the wells. And there is one interesting this thing that is made. There are many things. I just picked up one or two of them, so that just to pick your interest there. If the cane grows in a waterless region at a distance of 3 hands, the current flow to the west of it at a depth of 1.5 man height. So what that means is if you see a bunch of these cane is a crop that requires a lot of water. So if you don't see the water, but the cane is growing very well, what that means is there is some kind of an underground source of water for these things to go. And 3 hands are essentially about 3 feet, 3 to 4 feet. And that means there, and because cane, the roots of the cane are fibrous and they don't spread deep, they spread wide. So they say, okay, within 3 hands, you'll actually find some water. And also, where do you plant what kind of perfect crop? If you see a Nyagrodha tree in a region, in a plant, in a field, they say that it is fit for production of barley. If you see jambu trees, then that is suitable for bragram and sesame, growing sesame. Mango trees indicate happiness. Shami indicates famine. Arjuna, satisfactory rain in the region. So these are all like broad classification when you look at the kind of vegetation that is there. Essentially, a lot of this insight is coming from the understanding the agroclimatical region. Shami is something that is found in drier regions, so that will be more prone to famines. Arjuna, essentially in regions that have adequate rain. Mango, where there is a lot of rain. And that essentially is what they are talking about when they say mango trees indicate happiness. That means crops will grow well and these kind of things. And then they also talk about horticultural wonders. They say that, okay, if you do take the white flowers of a tree and then turn it into golden color, make sure that you water the tree with a mixture of turmeric powder, kimshuka, cotton seed, and manjistha and lodra. If you basically do this at the root, the flowers will turn golden. So this is a plausible thing. But then at the same time, we have to be very careful whenever we look at these texts, because whenever there is talking about these horticultural wonders, personally, I found some of them don't make too much sense to me. So, for example, let's say that if you take a plantain tree, which is essentially banana tree, you can create wonder by producing pomegranate on it. If you feed it with water mixed with the urine of a hog on Angola, I don't know what that has got to do with the plantain tree producing basically pomegranate. So I don't know really. Then so we need to really look into these things, claims, some of these claims very carefully. But most of the other things I have found are pretty reasonable and actually they make sense. And then there is also, for the pleasure gardens, it talks about garden houses should be protected from the sun by thick foliage of the atimu. So this is something that we call as a green wall these days. So he talks about how that can be done for the garden houses. And then basically these are the things that are there. And then it comes down to what is it that I would like you to, what can you do really? There is something called the World Scientist Warning to Humanity, a second notice. The first notice was given in 1992. 25 years later, in 2017, there was a second notice. Why was this given by the scientists? This was signed by scientists from almost like 130 countries. What they were worried about was that the world is going on an unsustainable path. And if we don't take care of our environment, our future is in danger. When I say our future is in danger, I'm not meaning to say that the earth is in danger. Earth is never in danger. Not the plant life, not the animal life. Something, they will all survive. It is the human race that will be wiped out. We'll just become the next dinosaurs. Life has survived before dinosaurs. Life has survived after dinosaurs. Just now, we don't have dinosaurs. Similarly, if we don't want to become another dinosaur, we need to take care of the earth in a good way. So the first thing that we need to do is to maintain nature's ecosystem services by halting the conversion of forests, grasslands, and other native habitats, reducing food wastage. Do you know that even today we produce enough food to feed 10 billion people? But we waste 30% of the food, so we can't feed even 7 billion people properly. And there is a lot of need to reduce that wastage. If in a developed country it occurs on a consumer plate, in a developing country mostly it occurs when it comes to the consumer plate. And promoting the dietary shift towards plant-based foods is something that is critical for the future of the earth. And then make sure that our children are basically educated about the outdoor nature education and then appreciate the nature. That is going to be the key if we want our next generation to do something and protect the planet that we are in. And then 3 takeaways for you all. Again, is to my urge will be to urge you all to study, understand, and advance the traditional wisdom. There is a lot that we can do. Conserve water resources and don't waste food. Show compassion to all beings and nurture them. These are all things that we can do. And 2 examples of things that have not even touched in my presentation today, because I was thinking that maybe we'll be running short of time. This is the Rani Ki Vav, which is essentially a rainwater harvesting well in Gujarat, step well. Beautiful architecture, beautiful way to conserve water, and extremely ingenious way of doing things. And then on the other side that you see to your right is the Chola Grand Anicut, which was built by Karikala I 2000 years ago. He built this in 2000 years ago, and it is still functional. This is one of the two oldest dams in the world and the only dam that is still functional today. And this kind of thing, when you look at it, and this one was, I mean, Britishers came in when they came to Madras presidency and when they were ruling. They also wanted to increase the irrigation efficiency of the whole Kaveri basin. So they wanted more flood waters to be diverted. So this one is essentially built to divert the flood waters of Kaveri to another branch of Kaveri, so that you can irrigate more lands because of the canal irrigation system that they have. So they wanted to do that again, and they built different sets of dams which were not very efficient. This was much more efficient and cost effective. So it tells you about the kind of the ingenious designs that we had. And a lot of those things can be learned. And another snippet of small information. One of my colleagues at IIT Indore did a study of surveys of many of the ponds and lakes that were built in Madhya Pradesh region. And he found that the storage capacity of these water bodies was very similar to the average rainfall of the area. So essentially they were storing water from the year. That was essentially whatever rain was falling, they were going to store that. And that is how these things were designed. How did they design it? All that. I mean, there's so much to study in all of these things. And another very interesting thing that we talk about today, but actually was mentioned in the basically Puranic and Vedic times, is that irrigation with the matka Sinchai Paddhati. Even Modi ji actually talked about this. The idea is to have small holes, that is not holes, basically the water will diffuse away, and you put it next to a plant, and you can irrigate it even in summer. And I have actually seen this in practice by farmers in very, very dry regions. They put this matka next to a big plant, because if you see this panasa plant here, this needs to survive for at least 2 to 3 years before the roots are deep enough for it to withstand the summers. So for that, they just take this matka, fill it with soil, and then this part will be open. They'll fill it with water and then close the lid. That's it. And every 4 days or 5 days, they'll come and fill the matka. And that's enough for the plant to survive the summer. And wonderful and ingenious method of doing things. And again, the Bharat Ki Vatikaye, I mean, if you look at the sacred groves, we actually have a culture of preserving a lot of these biodiversity in the sacred groves. And it is not something that is only coming from highly educated people, professors or things like that, but essentially if you go to the common men and women of India, so this is Padma Shri Yadav Mulai Peng. He's called Forest Man of India. He actually restored the entire island in Brahmaputra, in middle of Brahmaputra river, so that now it is a biodiversity hotspot. All why? Because he had a conversation with his grandfather in his childhood. When there was a flood, he saw some snakes coming. So he asked his grandfather, why are these snakes coming? And he said, his grandfather said, because beta, they don't have their home. They have lost their home, so they are coming. So he said, I'll build a home for them. And then planted trees on a barren river island. And now it is a lush green forest, and snakes don't come because they have their own place now. And you see, that is, so he was recognized with the Padma Shri in 2015. And then this to me is the epitome of what Bharatiyata is in the, when we talk of environment, agriculture, all those things, this is it. So this is Padma Shri Salumarada Timmakka ji. She and her husband planted more than 1 lakh trees in their lifetime. And they took care of them, and that's what they did for their entire life. They did not have children, and they said, these trees are our children. And you see, normally in India, I mean, whenever you receive an award, basically the person giving the award blesses. Here you see the kind of culture that Bharat's Rashtrapati is bowing down to this woman who has nurtured these trees. And this is the kind of ethos that we have in our country. The respect for the culture, environment, and culture of protecting the environment and protecting all that is related to the nature. So that to me basically shows what basically the Bharat is. And then I'll just end with what Mahamana Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya ji says many things there, but essentially I would request your attention to these 2 lines here. He says, Paap deenata daridrata aur dasta paap Prabhu dije swadhinata mite sakala santa. He talks about how it is a sin to be deenta, daridrata, or dasta, to be slavish mentality, or whether we talk about being poor or being vanquished. That is essentially something a sin. And he prays that we need that swadhinata so that all the sorrows can be taken away. And the first expression of a country's sovereignty is food security. And that is possible only through agriculture. And given the kind of history that we have, I think there is so much wisdom that we can learn, and so that we can address the future challenges as we move forward. With those things, thank you so much, and I'll stop here. Namaste, everyone.
Thank you very much, sir. Excellent presentation. So, just wanted to ask whether Ruksha Ayurveda is still available, and what is its best transcript or the explanation? And second is, was there any mentioning about the grafting in the ancient system, plant grafting?
Yes, there is a definite mention of grafting, not just of one plant, but many plants as well, and of the similar types and also of the dissimilar plants as well. There is mention of grafting in the Vriksha Ayurveda. And the texts, the ones that I have mentioned, are all available for purchase from the Asian Agri-History Foundation. You actually can go and buy them. I think it is 350 rupees for Vriksha Ayurveda and all that. So I have put the link to the this thing, source, there, right there. You actually can buy the books with the Sanskrit text and the translation. They have done a wonderful job.
You told about this one slide was from Arthashastra about ethical treatment of animals.
Yes.
So please elaborate the hunting part, because all the kings were very much into hunting that time. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So regarding the hunting, as per the Dharma Shastras, it was there were very strict rules governing the hunting part. It was in fact prohibited to hunt for the pleasure of the king. So you could not go and kill some animals in the wild, the forest, just because you wanted to have some fun. That was strictly prohibited. It was, for the kings, it was a duty to protect the people. Therefore, they were allowed to go and hunt if the people were coming and then saying that there are many tigers and they are basically attacking our villages, or some wild animals are attacking our villages, so you please control that. Then the king would go and then kill some of these animals and then protect the people. There also, there were rules, strict rules, in the sense that the king could not go during the time when the animals would mate in the forest, for example. So it was not allowed to go there. There were prohibited times and there were allowed times. One thing that we need to realize is the population of the humans at that time was very small, and the population of these wild animals was much, much higher than what we even know today. I mean, even if you go to 17th and 18th century, there were like few lakhs of tigers in the forests of India. Few lakhs. And today we hardly have 4,000-5,000 left. And so then that was actually a menace that was coming. So they were hunting them. Again, as per the rules laid down in Dharma Shastras. But after Britishers came and Mughals came, the hunting expeditions became much more for pleasure. And there was almost, especially after the Britishers came, it became like a competition between different kings of India to offer these hunting parties to these Britishers. And they would all go, these fellows would sit on a elephant, and then everybody would gather that animal, and then he would shoot, and then take a photograph and things like that. So that was becoming like a pleasure thing. And basically, it was very depraved in its practice. And that is why we have hunted the cheetahs to extinction. All these animals, majestic animals of our forest, have gone down in almost very near to the extinction. So that was essentially what was strictly proscribed, not allowed Dharma Shastra. Whatever we have done in last few hundred years is not something that was encouraged. There were very strong rules for hunting. Again, the rules for hunting for a king are different for hunting by a person who is living in a forest. For them, it is a matter of food, so they are allowed to hunt, not a king. So there was a distinction in all of these things.
Good morning, sir. So I have a special. Good morning. I have a question. You are talking about the agricultural system of ancient Indian civilization. So after the excavation of Harappan civilization, we saw that there was beneath the ground there is a huge place where the food was being stored. Any special technique was adopted by that time? Do you have any idea? Can you please light upon us where how that the huge amount of food grains were stored without not affecting getting by the insects or something like that? That was amazing
Yeah.
to me. That was amazing for us.
Yes, and one of the very important things there, that's a very important question that you have raised. Important thing is, imagine that in the past, we had a drought for a year and we could not plant the seeds. But it was not simply about storing the seeds, but you had to maintain the viability of the seeds so that it would be available not just for next year, but also the year later also. And there were different techniques that were developed for storing the seeds versus storing the grains. And so if you look on YouTube, there is a technique that the Afghanis use for storing grapes. What they do is they take two pots and they put grapes, fresh grapes in them, close them, and then seal it with mud. That was a kind of technology that was used, it's still being used in many tribal areas today. What they will do is they'll take a matka, the earthen pot, fill it with grains, then stuff it with straw. Then they pack it with mud and then seal it. And it is said that the grains in that can remain viable for up to 2 to 3 years or even more. So this is what basically some of the technologies were there for seed preservation. And for preserving the grains as such, for that we had these huge pots, earthen pots. They were almost 1 to 2 meter, 1 meter height and 1 meter in diameter as well. So there were those granite, small like earthen pots, but also the granaries that are there. I mean, in fact, if you look into some of the excavated remains of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, you will see granaries. So by that time also it was established. So that we are talking about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. They had established granaries and those things for food, but for grains, you also had these kind of technologies. There are many, and I'm not familiar with all of them. There is a lot of need to investigate that.
Namaskar, sir.
Namaste.
Seeing at your slides, I'm grateful that I got to know that agriculture is the backbone of the economy. But nowadays, we have various other career opportunities and pathways that are more glamorous than agriculture. And people like me also are not much interested in pursuing that. How do I motivate myself and the other people to take this up and follow it up? And second, those few people who are working really hard in this field and trying to make their living through the ancient and more effective way of agriculture, how do I support them?
Thank you. That is a very important question, because how do we get reconnected to the agricultural traditions? So a very simple way I would suggest is very simple. We all can do that. We all have flower pots in our homes, right? We keep plants, flowering plants. What I would suggest is just get a few grains of paddy, plant them, go and see that entire magic happen. See the same thing with wheat. See the same thing with each of these crops. And just if you can do that, I'm telling you, you'll see the entire thing, how it grows and all that. Really, you'll see what it takes to grow a crop. And that is a very quick way of getting connected with the crops. And this does not require any land. It just requires few pots. And if you are fortunate enough to have like a home garden, even better, try growing some vegetables. It will be fun experience to do that.
मूर्ति जी नमस्कार.
Namaste.
मैं पंकज बोल रहा हूँ, पंकज गुप्ता. And I have one question that these days we face this problem of parali. I live in Delhi. So पहले जमाने में in the earlier time how the parali problem was handled. I happened to meet somebody in a flight. They said that in UP region they give that straw to their animals. So hardly there is a problem of burning that parali. But here I live in Sonipat and in the nearby places, you know that what problem we are facing in Delhi. So I'd like to know that how it was handled in the ancient times. Thank you.
Unfortunately, this parali problem that we have, the straw and the burning associated with that, which causes huge pollution in Delhi and all, is a problem of modern making. In fact, if you go back to 25, 30 years, we did not have this kind of a problem there. The primary reason why this has happened is because we lack systems approach to our natural systems. And what has happened is there was a lot of groundwater that was being drawn in Punjab and Haryana for growing rice and basically the crops in the summer. So what they would do to prevent the groundwater from going down, what the governments did there was they said, you cannot withdraw the groundwater in the months of May and June. What that meant was the planting of these crops cannot be done until end of June. And because of that, the entire cropping season is pushed to October. And because of that, then now think about what happens in the environment. In the environment, what happens in the October is there is a stagnant cell of air in the Punjab, Haryana, Delhi, Western UP, all those regions. So what happens is now you have that. So, and then on top of that, you also have, because the cropping season was shifted to almost to the end of June, then the harvesting happens in the second week or third week of October, and you have to plant it within the first week of November. So the gap for the farmers is very, very small. They can't clear the parali or the straw from the fields. Now, what is the quickest option for them? They just burn it. Now, you have the environmental conditions, which is like a closed room. There is no wind blowing in that whole northern region, Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, Delhi regions. You have the problem of late harvest of the crops, and you also have the problem of this not being sufficient, the window not being sufficient to clear off the straw from the field. What that does is you basically have a burnt, they are going to burn it, there's going to be this pollution, and it will not be cleared because of any of these things. The fundamental thing, why did this come about, is because of two things. One, the groundwater, and also there is a new variety of crops that Monsanto introduced in around 2008-2009. If you think about it, around 2000 we did not have this problem. It was not as significant. We were burning, but it was not as significant. Because if you burn 15 days earlier or 15 days later, the winds move. And there is that circulation and it clears off. But because we do that in October now, it basically is a problem. This year in Diwali, we did not have too much of pollution. Why? That was not because crackers caused pollution and that nonsense. It was primarily because there was a unseasonal rain, so the farmers delayed burning of the straw by a week. So you saw that peak happen in the first week of November, rather than in the Diwali time. I mean, it is a problem that we have created ourselves. But it can also be addressed by us if we understand the causes well.
Namaste, sir. So as you touched upon in your slide that the irreparable damage caused due to green revolution, and somewhere down the line there is a mad rush of adopting huge pesticides and GMO seeds. So I wanted to understand in contemporary times, as you touched, that a state or a governance has to first secure its food security to protect its sovereignty, and somewhere down the line it has to do a trade-off, or it has to navigate managing both. So are there any examples in contemporary times where they have manifested this ancient wisdom and some successful pilot projects which we can replicate throughout the country?
Yes, thank you for asking that question. There are many examples. One thing what I would not suggest, in fact what I'm not at all advocating, is a whole-scale movement of the current industrial agriculture to the so-called organic agriculture or even the Vedic agriculture completely. No, we should not do that. Because at that time the population densities were less and the food production needs were also less. I mean, if you talk about India's population at independence, we were 33 crores. If you go back 200 years, we'll probably be 15 crores or 10 crores. Feeding 10 crore people is a different ball game than feeding 134 crore people. So we do need the modern methods. what we need to ensure is that we don't damage the soil or the environment in the process. For that, we need to go back into our traditional agriculture wisdom and then harness it. There is, because just to give you a very practical example that has recently happened, what the Sri Lankan government did stupidly, based on some of the NGOs based in India's recommendation, they switched completely to organic agriculture. They said no fertilizers will be used, no pesticides will be used. What that has caused was a 40 to 50% decline in their crop productivity, and they were facing food shortages within 4 months. So that kind of a stupidity should not be done. What we need to do is we can actually adopt some of these practices, like I was talking about the Kunapa Jala. That is something that we can use as a liquid fertilizer to build the soil health, and slowly you have to wean off on the fertilizer. So there is also IFCO, the Fertilizer Corporation of India, they have come up with something called a nano fertilizer. So instead of putting a bag of fertilizer, urea, you just have to take a 500 ml of nano fertilizer, and that can be sprayed. So that is an advance in technology. Now, again, you can use the Kunapa Jala, you can use a lot of these fumigation methods which don't require pesticide use. All of these things can be used so that we maintain our food production. So it has to be a blend of the modern methods with the ancient wisdom. It cannot just be one or the other. That is the kind of thing that needs to be done. And it would be called more of a sustainable agriculture than an organic agriculture or a industrial agriculture, in my opinion. And sustainable agriculture is something that we can do. In fact, many farmers across the country are adopting this, slowly using these kind of Panchagavya, Gavyamrit, all those things that are trying to use are actually part of these kind of these things, approaches. They're not completely abandoning the urea fertilizers. They're not completely abandoning pesticides even now. They're supplementing that with this, and then slowly they're weaning off from these toxic chemicals and fertilizers, reducing the dosage, increasing their effectiveness.